I'm ready.
All right, we should be live. Excited to do this again with you this week, Bryant. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Tad. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, well, so we talked about this week doing a Q&A, but we have to wait for some people to show up. So while we're doing that, I want to talk about what I've been thinking about today, which was a webinar I watched from someone from DRAM talking about dissolved oxygen.
I got that email, and I was thinking about signing up. I just didn't have time. So I'm super curious to hear what you thought, what you think, and what you heard.
Yeah, so the big takeaways on it, I thought, were that we need to be aware of the fact that dissolved oxygen water in our reservoirs or in our irrigation can play a pivotal role in managing biofilm and promoting root growth and root health is essentially the big thing, which we already kind of knew that. But what I thought was really interesting about it was that basically if we improve the dissolved oxygen level in our water, we're going to see a dramatic increase in root health and actually root growth, to where in the study they did at Metrolina, which is one of the largest ornamental greenhouse producers in the country, they saw a 7 to 14 day reduction in the time it took for the plugs to get developed that they were putting out. So production time went down dramatically, which is a big deal. If you can get your plant, from here to here 2 weeks faster, it makes a big difference. So yeah, that was kind of exciting to see.
Yeah, interesting. Did they touch on how they're increasing dissolved oxygen in the water?
Yeah, he talked about a few different ways to do it, and also how some different oxidizers, how oxidizing they are, essentially. Everything from oxygen all the way up to ozone and hydrogen peroxide being in between, just in terms of managing biofilm. And I think one of the things that I learned that makes sense, I hadn't really thought about, is before we talk about raising oxygen levels in the water, whether through a bubbler or some sort of super saturation device, is we have to remove the chlorine or chloramines first through a filtration, like a carbon filter, because those are going to affect the ability of the water, of the dissolved oxygen, to really essentially kick up to the levels that we want.
I wondered, I'm sure they didn't go this detail, but do you know to what levels chlorine have to be?
They didn't say. They just said since COVID, they've seen higher levels of chlorine and chloramine in water, municipal water supplies, and it's become more problematic and something that they look at removing. And basically, he didn't get into it because this was at the very end during the Q&A session that he kind of touched on it. So he didn't go into a lot of detail. I might have to follow up with him and see if I can do a podcast with him, because it had me thinking about how I could, in an inline system, potentially raise dissolved oxygen, or look at, running some experiments with that, or for just my cuttings, if I want to, rather than just watering directly out of a faucet, if it's worth aerating that water prior to water to get more oxygen into it.
Well, yeah. So it's interesting. I have a friend. I think he may have. He's in the area. He's across the valley. Let's see if I could point to his house. No. Yeah. And he increased dissolved oxygen in his water years ago for hemp production, and he, just anecdotally was digging up plants and seeing very significant root zone differences. And that caught my attention. And I went down the rabbit hole for a day, maybe, or 4 hours, researched dissolved oxygen, found that the results were significant. But two things. One is, like you said, it kind of depends on how you're increasing oxygen levels in the water. And I found that just aerating it doesn't increase oxygen that much, if I remember right. and it really takes like a better injection. I was like reading about ozone. I was reading about nanobubble systems, which you know, I guess my other thought on this is once you get into that, you start to my like spidey senses were kind of prickling when it comes to the water snake oil. I mean, there's so much in like kind of snake oil in water that I don't know why. I mean, people love like water energetics and water structuring and just so many different things around water that I started drowning in the information and not knowing what was legitimate and what was sort of like fishy. So I kind of got stuck in terms of trying to figure out how to oxygenate water in a cost-effective way that was actually effective. Because a lot of the research shows that if you just bubble a pond, for example, or bubble a tank, and then you send it out in an irrigation event, it doesn't actually increase dissolved oxygen much. Could be wrong. This was like 2 years ago I did this research. So anyway, those are my thoughts. I'm super interested in it.
So the webinar will be available, I guess, after they upload it and everything. So people can go back and check it out, which is nice.
It's so funny. I got that email and was like, why does Dram have my email address? But it definitely piqued my interest. Yeah,
it's through Growers Magazine or Growers Network or somewhere else. I can track it down for folks if anyone's interested. The takeaways, though, that he pointed out in terms of this whole supersaturation is one, you need a dissolved oxygen meter to really know what you're doing there.
Totally.
And he gave a range of different levels and said kind of where they fall and what's optimal. I have a slide here I can just pull up. So I'm reading off the slide. So basically, let me find it. Did I not? Is that the one slide I didn't screenshot? It is.
That's all right. That's all right.
Basically, though, what we need to we don't pour a bunch of hydrogen peroxide in and then stick your meter in there because that's not going to give you an actual idea. You need to test at what your level is at the irrigation point.
Emitter.
So if it's yes, exactly. So if it's going through a whole line, you may have started at 20 ppm, but by the time it reaches the end, it may be at 10.
That's
and you
right.
have to say, okay, that can relate to the temperature of the water. So if it's colder, it's easier for it to hold dissolved oxygen. It could relate to the pressure. So if the pressure goes down, then your dissolved oxygen will go down as well. And then biofilm is the other one. So he said, if you see your ppm start to go up over the next week or two as you're watering, that means the oxygen is probably killing any biofilm you had in your line. But then he said, if you start to see it go down again, there's actually aerobic biofilms that can form in lines, which wasn't something I was aware of.
Interesting.
So
it's interesting that increased oxygen would kill biofilm. I guess it depends, like you're saying, on the species of biofilm.
Yeah, so most biofilm, as I understand it, is anaerobic. That's the way I've always thought it. They were primarily anaerobe. So I didn't really think of like aerobic biofilms as being a real concern, but apparently that is something that can happen over time. So
fascinating. Thanks for sharing. This is very cool.
Yeah, but I see we've had a few people that have showed up now. We've got one question so far that I can throw up on the screen. I haven't even read it yet, so I just thought it was a question. This person says do you want to read it?
Sure. Yeah. So his buddy left his lights on for an extra 12 hours deep in flower at week 6. What's the best way to keep them on schedule? Wasn't sure, but he has a guess. Personally, I would immediately get them back on schedule and just keep them on the flower schedule. I don't think you can reverse the mistake. Is that kind of what he's getting at? I mean, what action can you take to reduce the probability of hermaphrodism maybe, or do you have any thoughts? I mean, I'm like, get them back on schedule.
Yeah. So if it's only 12 hours, I would immediately just, like you said, go right back to your normal 12-12 schedule. I don't think that 12-hour, blip is going to be enough to trigger enough hormonal changes in the plant to be a really huge issue. Where I typically see problems with hermaphrodism in re-vegging is when you have a light leak that you weren't aware of, and it goes on for a period of time, days to weeks. And that's where I typically see problems. But you would want to be more diligent about watching for seed production and things like that. I personally wouldn't flip day to night cycle, just because typically you set up your day to night cycle for a reason, whether that's because of electrical concerns in terms of cost or things like that, or the fact that like these are the hours when you can go into your room. So I don't think it's enough of a concern for me to flip my whole cycle over a 12-hour difference.
Okay. So so maybe the flipping from day to night, I definitely wouldn't do. I mean, I also, just in terms of your working periods, being in the room and such.
And let's be clear, Bryant and I are not lighting experts. So this is not necessarily, I would say, our area of expertise as much. So
not
here,
at all, but I do think it's possible to, and this happens all the time, not just in lighting, but in all sort of facets of ag. So for example, if you don't water and you're trying to catch up, playing catch up is such a thing across all, facets of farming. And I think that you can quite frequently cause more harm by trying to correct a mistake than just moving past it. But a good point. I definitely am not a lighting guy.
I would probably say just go to dark and just go dark for 24 hours if it were me. But I don't think either is really going to make a big difference, personally, if it's just a 12-hour mistake. Do we not have a lot of questions? I mean, I can come up with a topic. I was hoping we could get people asking questions. So yes, Drew, what I'm suggesting is 24 hours of darkness and then go back into your 12-12. But yeah, someone asked if biofilm is harmful, or that type of biofilm. We could talk a little bit about that.
I mean, my issue with biofilm is you just start to, if you get too much growth in your lines, you're going to have plugs and clogs and issues.
Yeah, and you can have reproduction happening below that film, that slime. The reason that it's produced is so the bacteria can survive. And as I understand it, it can be more of a habitat for pathogens and things like that, which is why we want to remove it. Jeff Lowenfels always uses the analogy of, your teeth in the morning, the biofilm that the bacteria produce overnight, that plaque too. All of those things are biofilms that are created by bacteria as a way of protecting themselves. And that's why we remove them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll also mention that biofilm. I haven't had a lot of issues in the past in my outdoor cultivation, except when I start injecting a lot of nitrogen. That's really where I see an explosion of growth in my lines. I know it happens naturally over time in a lot of situations, a lot of warm environments, but that's when I've seen it increase just exponentially.
Yeah, and I try not to put anything biological through irrigation lines unless you absolutely have to. And then if you do, you need to flush afterwards. But when people ask me, like, if we're not broad scale acreage, if we're talking about like a facility or a home grow, I'll just tell them to make the compost tea or whatever microbial product you're adding and just water it in over the top of your irrigation system. Don't put it through your lines because it's not necessarily worth it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Heavy metal accumulation, interesting. I mean, heavy metals accumulate from what I've seen, the levels are highest in roots actually. And then I don't remember the difference between stems, leaves, flowers, but the heavy metals will distribute throughout the plant.
They will. The research that I've seen shows that it, like you said, roots and then stems and then leaves is sort of in that order, with flowers sort of being the last hit spot, and older flowers will have higher levels. So if you're sending in a sample for testing, you want to remove as much leaf matter and as much stem as you can from the sample, and you want to pick a newer bud site if you can. That's the advice I've been given from researchers who actually look at.
That's really smart. I've never thought about that, but I think that is a golden nugget, actually. Because if you think about anything immobile, it's going to be higher. Like, for example, calcium will always be higher in the old leaves because it just has more time, through transpiration and phloem mobilization and just movement. It just has more time to accumulate those immobile things. And so I'm sure heavy metals are no different.
Yeah, and that's also a big reason if you're looking at managing your soil for heavy metals that you want to remove the root ball, remove all the leaves rather than dropping them back onto the surface. You're removing heavy metals out of that soil and out of your facility. So it's a good approach. All right, we're starting to get some questions. Now let's see if we can keep up with them here. We're kind of jumping around, but I'll just go in the order. Paul asked, can you recommend a good water filter?
I'm not a filter expert. I don't know. Unfortunately, I tell people, I take the easy route as I look at hundreds of water tests and I tell people when they need to filter, but I never recommend what filter they should get, which is maybe not helpful. Usually it depends on what you're trying to filter is the short answer. Yeah. But in general, RO, any good RO filter, doesn't matter the brand, will be effective. But then when people use like anything that's not RO, I find that they are completely hit or miss in terms of their ability to filter. And actually, I'd say they're more on the miss side. So my only recommendation is when you start using a new filter, test before and test after and just see if it's actually working. But that doesn't answer your question.
I mean, if we're talking about heavy metals, you really have to go to RO. There aren't a lot of other great options, unfortunately. If we're talking about chlorine and chloramines, a simple carbon inline filter, like you would use for an RV, or I think Boogie Brew is the most popular one I see in the cannabis industry, should work just fine. But also I tend to do what you do and say, contact the local water expert, because they're going to know your water supply way better than anyone else. And they can tell you like what to watch for and probably the best way to remove it.
Yeah. That said, you want to, there's people who are really good at filtration and will set you up with a really customized solution. However, a lot of people will recommend like water softeners because they're used to trying to treat water for plumbing or for, in this case, it'd be hard water, but drinking or plumbing are usually the ones why people are filtering water. And sometimes they implement the wrong solution for horticulture. There's a filter tons of people use. I always see this called like Hardy Boy or something. Do you know what I'm talking about, Tad? It's something boy. Anyway, that one tends to be totally ineffective from the data I've seen. I wish I had the name right, but yeah, it depends on what you're trying to filter. I mean, sodium is the one that I wish I had a better option or a better recommendation than RO, but I don't think I've seen a filter that's not an RO filter that removes sodium effectively.
I can't really speak to that either. Okay, just going down the line, kind of jumping around here. CFUs of trichoderma in a product. I have a small thought, but did you want to comment at all about?
No, all I know is just from what I've read is that just source and variability and quality varies dramatically with trichoderma. So I don't know if that's the density and the quantity of spores, or if it's just the species, or I guess not the species, but the kind of trichoderma that's being cultivated. I'm not really sure. I don't know in terms of the count.
So a couple things just to think about. If you're going to buy a microbial product, if it were me and I'm going to spend money on microbes, I want to buy them from a reputable source because like you mentioned, Bryant, they can vary dramatically. In my experience, BioWorks, for example, has a great product. And keep in mind too, that with trichoderma or any of like mycorrhizal fungi is the one I think of the most. Every strain is going to be a little bit different. So even though like it says trichoderma, there's a T22 strain that's been bred specifically, and that's going to have very unique properties in terms of what ranges of temperatures and environments it can survive in, how rapidly it's going to be able to colonize various medias. It's going to be different for peat and cocoa and soil. So it's more complicated than people realize. You can't just grab a trichoderma product and say it's going to be the same and just compare, CFUs like this, because all of these strains have different viability and they have different levels. And sometimes the levels on the package are not going to match what's on the actual, what's in the product itself. So,
yeah, I mean, I agree. I always just, when I use trichoderma, I use Root Shield, and it's only because I just know it's legit, but it definitely hurts the bank account a little bit, but I know it's a legitimate product. And similar to the mycorrhizae, just to follow up, the single reason I like to, in my orchard, when I transplant trees, any transplant I put in the ground, when I'm inoculating with mycorrhizae, I like to use a granular product. The reason I've gotten Dynamyco from you, Tad, is because when you researched that inventor, that founder, he explained a little bit of how they bred those strains of mycorrhizae, and it seemed to match the ecosystem in which I'm growing, which was a desert environment. I think it was created in Israel. I don't know if I have that right, but in any case,
that's correct.
I was really trying to match the ecosystem in which the strains were developed to my ecosystem, because if you put a strain from a really wet, humid, acidic soil into a dry, arid, high pH soil, it's really reducing your chance of success. Great.
Okay, I want to touch on this really quick because this person's put a comment on my video before, and then we'll jump on to another question. So I made a video showing, I posted a video showing swollen nodes relating to HLVD, and this person commented on the video and said it was false. And I just thought it'd be easier to address it since they're obviously here listening and feel strongly about it. Yes, it can also be. So basically, here's the thing. It can be related, as it was explained to me by Three Rivers Biotech, is that it can be related. Swollen nodes can be a symptom of HLVD. They are not always a symptom of LVD. It can also be genetics. It can be related to something else, but it is one of the symptoms that they have seen consistently across the board for this. And they're doing some of the leading research with, I don't know why I can't think of his name right now, the researcher out of Canada that's putting out all the papers on HLVD right now. It'll come to me later. This head cold is really making it hard for my brain to think as well as I wanted to. But yeah, so I'm not going to take the video down. You're welcome to your opinion. Feel free to share whatever research you want on there. And as long as you keep it positive, I will leave your posts up as long as there's no personal insults. So, all right, moving on to you, Bryant. Here's one for you.
Yeah, definitely. In general horticulture, this is done all the time. In fact, in tree fruit production, almost every single IPM foliar has nutrition in it, and almost never does a nutrition foliar not have IPM in it, I guess is another way to say it. I'm trying to think of any to avoid. There's so many IPM products that, anything with sulfur or copper, any topical fungicide, I would not combine any nutrition into it. Anything not organic, you really got to be careful, because there's so many IPM products.
Good pesticide products will have on the label, or they'll have a website you can go to that lists compatibility.
There you go. That's the answer. Side. That's the best. And most good products, the label on the front of the bottle is extensive, and I would recommend devoting like 30 minutes before a spray to really dive into that label.
Yeah, two things on pesticides I want to touch on, just because we're kind of talking about them already. One, always spray to the label rate. that's super important, because if you think, okay, I want to spray a little less because I want to be more eco about this. Those label rates are super important because they're established at what's going to give you the lowest concentration of actual pesticide with optimal kill rates. Otherwise, your pests are building up a resistance. If you don't quite kill the pest and it's able to survive, the next time you spray that same pesticides, it's going to be less effective. So we want to use multiple modes of action, unless it's something like a suffocant or a beneficial insect, because of this resistance issue. And we always want to make sure to wear whatever PPE is recommended by the pesticide on the label, and then spray the label rates. Those are just the things I've learned from Suzanne.
Yeah, and I would even add that if the label rate is a range, I personally don't go to the in the bottom or the top of the range, because if there's any inefficiency in spraying where you slightly underspray or slightly overspray, I don't want to fall outside of that range. I'm extremely paranoid of staying in that label rate range. So I go usually, unless the pest pressure is higher or lower, I go right in the middle, because if I underspray or overspray one part of my operation, I know I'm still hitting the label rate. I'd also say that one thing when you were talking, Tad, that popped up is oil. So when you combine certain nutritional products with oil, you increase the probability of phytotoxicity.
That's a good point.
Depends on the oil rate, and it depends on the nutritional product, but definitely be careful with that.
Yeah, and oils and sulfurs do not mix at all.
Absolutely not. Yeah. Well, again, depends on the rate, but that's a good way to create phytotoxicity really, really fast.
Yeah. All right, jumping around. pH. Why don't you tackle this one?
Okay. The pH is to lower their pH. Okay, so the ppm is less than 50. I would not recommend pHing the water, because if the total ppms are less than 50, then it's impossible for bicarbonate, or more specifically this metric of water called alkalinity, to be above about 120 to 150 ppm. That's when I recommend acidifying water, because above, let's just say 120 to 150 ppm of total alkalinity, which is made up not just of bicarbonates, but also hydroxides and oxides. And above that level, the water will start to negatively influence your soil pH and your soil solution pH and your plant's ability to uptake nutrients. Below that level, the soil should buffer the water very easily. So a high pH water with low ppms means that the soil is going to buffer that water.
One thing that this doesn't tell you, though, is what that creating that ppm, that EC. And so if it's primarily calcium, great, not a problem. If it's sodium or chlorides or something like that, then it could still potentially be an issue. But and a water test from Logan is what, like $25, $30. They're not terribly expensive. It's a nice, as soon as I moved to this house where I live right now, that was the first thing I did, was to get an irrigation suitability test.
Absolutely. It's literally a one-time test. People always say, like, well, my water might change through the season. That's true, but I don't see it change wildly. I consider an irrigation test a one-time expense. It's a one-time test just to get a baseline. You can do it more often if you want, but you're going to see the same general trend across time. Also, just in terms of what makes up that 50 ppm, even if it were sodium or chloride, I still wouldn't recommend pHing the water, because that won't remove the sodium or the chloride. It'll change the pH of the water, but the sodium and the chloride are still there and still available. So then you're talking about filtration.
I recently picked up a blueberry seedling from Damien, and he notes it likes lower pH. This is a great question. So how do we lower pH using amendments or minerals to make it more suitable for blueberries? And I just want to add a note to this. I planted blueberries in my biochar soil in a container, and they just did not grow. And that was because I just completely spaced on the fact that it was so far out of range that once I was able to lower the pH, the blueberries were a lot happier, and I saw a lot of vigorous growth happening at that point.
So I used to do a lot of work in blueberries back when I had roots in Oregon. And yeah, I love blueberries because they're odd. They're a very unique crop, mostly due to the pH thing, but they're also just one of the most, I think they're the second most profitable crop in the U.S. organically, and they're delicious. So they can generally do well up to about 6.2, 6.3, but they far prefer the mid fives. Organically, the only way to reduce the pH quickly and effectively in the majority of soils would be elemental sulfur. The application rate depends on a number of things, mostly if you're in like a living soil or if you're in topsoil. But you really want to use elemental sulfur or acidification of your water using sulfur until you drop the pH of your soil down to like mid fives, really like low fives to kind of upper fives. The blueberries will thrive. They can do okay a little bit higher. Non-organically, there's a number of methods. You can use other kinds of acid. Honestly, sulfur is still the best option. In theory, if you already have the plant, you got to do it quick, and sulfur may not even be the best option. If you have the plant, it's ready to be transplanted, you have to use powdered elemental sulfur, almost like wettable sulfur, because the surface area of the elemental sulfur is going to dictate the rate of reaction. So most elemental sulfurs sold in like granular pellets, and it takes quite a long time in pelleted form to reduce the pH because the microbes take a long time to oxidize those pellets. So it's all about surface area in terms of the rate of reaction. So for you're going to have to find powdered sulfur and do it ASAP. And I would say like 6 cups, if just as a baseline rate in a living soil, peat-based media, 6 cups per cubic yard, thoroughly incorporated. That's the key. Don't just surface apply it. Otherwise the surface of your soil will go down to like 3.5, and the rest of the soil won't change. So you have to till it in. 6 cups per cubic yard of soil volume tends to be a good starting rate.
Now, Brian, I want to ask you, what about if he mentioned it's a blueberry seedling, so I'm picturing something pretty small. What if you were just to go down and pick up some peat moss at the local store and then maybe mix a little bit of gypsum in with that and possibly a little bit of perlite or pumice?
That's a great idea, because so in my soil, pH of 8.2, the only way to grow a blueberry, because I can't acidify with sulfuric acid, there's too much free lime in the profile. The only method, well, there's a few, but they're very long-term. The only immediate method is to bury a bale of peat moss and plant right into that with, I would say, I would honestly use cottonseed meal for nitrogen. I'd use maybe a little bit. I'd definitely use gypsum. So mix in, because peat moss has no nutrients in it. It's almost inert. It's just carbon sponge. So I'd probably mix in some aggregate, cottonseed meal, gypsum, maybe some alfalfa meal. And
just to simplify it, could you literally do like just maybe a little bit of gypsum or even just water with some fish hydrolysate, for example?
You could.
I'm just trying to think of like the simplest.
That's actually a better idea, because fish hydrolysate is naturally a little bit, not naturally, but it comes out of the bottle acidic. So you just go, there's products like bone meal, soft rock phosphate. There's organic products that push the pH up. So put it in peat moss and water it with liquid fish. And gypsum's optional in that case.
And make sure you have some aeration in there too. Though actually, I don't even know if you need a lot of aeration with.
No, so the blueberries, they evolved in their boggy. Kind of.
That was a bad advice.
Just on this, I know there's other questions, but what's interesting about, it's like, why does a blueberry need pH? It's an interesting question. And I looked at, I'm like, what if I could grow a blueberry in a high pH soil? And it's because the micronutrients, specifically iron and manganese, want to be in the reduced form. So they really like reduced iron and manganese, which only happens at really low pHs in oftentimes not totally anaerobic, but sort of boggy soils. And my understanding is that's why they actually like low pH. So I don't know where I was going with that. Oh, they like kind of a boggy, high organic matter type of peat environment.
I want to address this post right here from Ken, because I can see a conversation going on in the comments on this.
I thought about this.
Do you want to go first?
No, I don't know. You go.
Oh, okay. So this was my understanding in the sense that trichoderma, it's not a mold, but it is a very aggressive microbe. And essentially, there was some research, I think it was out of the University of Florida, that showed that high phosphorus and potentially trichoderma would inhibit mycorrhizal infection. Now, I took this up with Dr. Yoram Kapolnik, who you mentioned earlier, the Israeli researcher who created Dynamyco, as well as with the founders of what's the product from Plant Success? It's like the most popular myco product on the market for a long time. It's got multiple species in there.
It's got like white and yellow branding.
Oh, there, that's it. Great White. I talked to one of the people from Great White. There, he came on the podcast, and then one other person, and they all told me that certain species of trichoderma can actually be symbiotic with mycorrhizal fungi. They won't compete with each other. Oh, and Bioworks, same thing. The pathologist from Bioworks. So I've kind of changed my position on this based on what I've learned from people that are way smarter and study this more than I do. So I wouldn't be concerned about applying mycorrhizal fungi and trichoderma, but if I were to do it, I would probably do the myco right at in the root zone, directly in contact with the roots at the earliest stage possible, whether it's a seedling, rooted clone during that transplant, and then maybe a week later, or whenever down the road, I would hit it with trichoderma.
Yeah, interesting. That's good to know. That's good to hear that the people you trust say that, because I have gone through this exact thought experiment because I've done this on hundreds of acres, the combination.
Yeah.
And I've recommended it on hundreds of acres, and I have done it multiple years in my own operation. And the first year I was struggling with that question big time. It was like keeping me up at night. And yeah. I decided to go with both, but not because I was confident with it, simply because when in doubt, I sort of defer to biodiversity hashing it out.
And if you think about it, we know that these both exist naturally in soils and have relationships with plants and have soil functions in terms of ecological niches that they fill. So it makes sense. Now, the levels that we're applying them is a whole nother conversation, and microbial persistence at those levels is a separate conversation too. But I think it's good. It's a good practice to use both from what I've heard from these folks. All right, maybe two more questions. Yeah, and this is not one that I feel like I have a lot of expertise on. If you want to take this one, that would be great.
Okay, so I'm going to address the second part first. So if you want to get your organic matter up fast, I don't think, and I'm working off the traditional definition of organic matter, like soil organic matter that you would find in topsoil. Humic substances are not necessarily the way to do that quickly and in high quantities. They act as biostimulants, and they provide soluble carbon, which is very important. They chelate nutrients. They feed microbiology. They do a whole bunch of things, but from a tradition, just in the traditional sense, they're not building organic matter. But to address your actual question, which is, can they be over applied? Yeah, I mean, in cannabis cultivation, I would be I would want to test for heavy metals. Also, humic substances vary dramatically across the sources in which they come from. So they essentially mine the substance, and then they sort of refine it into different fractions of humic substances. So it could be over applied depending on what's in it. And that's just an open-ended question. I would say that regardless of so in theory, yes, it could totally be over applied. I think there's diminishing returns to what you're going to receive from humic substances. And so therefore I wouldn't test that upper limit, because there's no reason to. I think once you apply a certain quantity, you're getting the benefit. And if you apply more than that, you're not going to necessarily get any benefit. because you've already flooded the soil with that fraction of soluble carbon. And going beyond that is just going to contribute potentially aluminum, heavy metals. But you're never going to like chelate everything out of availability, or there's no like theoretical, I guess, function that happens other than just applying too much of an element you don't want.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, it's always best with things like this, and most amendments in general are best applied in small doses over the course of the cycle versus trying to dump it all in at once. And humic acid would be a great example of that.
I mean, the best, if again, I'm working off the organic matter definition that I know, which is, long-lasting carbon in your soil that's cycling and giving all the benefits of organic matter. The best way to do it is always have living roots, maximize the health of your plant, keep various forms and lengths of carbon flowing into the system constantly, whether that's through compost, mulch, organic matter, plant growth, cover crops, etc. And if you're in a peat-based living soil, I wouldn't even worry about organic matter. If you're in topsoil, I would. And I would do all the things I just mentioned. Keep your soil covered, minimize disturbance if possible, just kind of like basic NRCS principles.
All right, Bryant, I know we're a little long. There's 2 more questions that I really like. Can we do them in the next 3 or 4 minutes? Do you have time for that?
I mean,
and then we'll call
I can't promise 3 or 4 minutes, but let's do them.
All right. So I thought this was worth addressing. Smiley's Garden asked, do you worry at all about the pesticides used in cotton? Because you had mentioned cottonseed meal.
Yeah, I mean, cottonseed meal is not my, I would almost never use it unless I was really trying to keep an acidic environment. So do I worry about the pesticides in cottonseed meal? Not really, because I'm not like, I try to avoid getting worried about pesticides. Otherwise my whole life would be full of anxiety. But yeah, cottonseed meal is not my favorite nitrogen source. The only reason I said that is because it's very acidic. So if you're just trying to keep a really acidic environment for your blueberry plant, then it might be a good choice. And I wouldn't be worried about pesticide residual in that one, little area of soil.
And I want to add, there's a certain sort of dogma around organics right now where that I see with, pesticide residue, the slaughterhouse industry, all of these like large agricultural or meat-based industries that we have that we're getting our amendments from, whether it's, cottonseed, seed, alfalfa, bone meal, blood meal, fish bone, they're all coming from these, massive systems that our food supply, more or less. Interestingly enough, I've been doing a deep dive on blood and bone meal specifically and how dangerous those are. Because you hear that they're coming from a slaughterhouse, which is bad, and they're going to be full of, growth hormones and, maybe some pesticide residue from what the grass that the beef ate, or that the chicken or the cow ate, things like that. And basically what I've distilled it down to is most of the pesticide residue is not making it through the animal. Now, if you're applying directly a seed meal, I think that it's more of a risk. And then antibiotics too are not making it they're making it into the manure. So your compost source, especially manure-based compost, is a much higher risk than your bone or blood meal, at least in that regard.
Definitely.
And then the ocean is not as clean as we want it to be, I guess is what I want to say there, unfortunately. Yeah. So there's a pro and con to every single amendment nowadays.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I've never, ever worried about slaughterhouse products. I feel like it's my obligation to use them because I eat meat, and I try to eat, really, hunt, and I do all the things that you're supposed to do, but I still feel a moral obligation to use the entire animal. And so I actually like using bone meal. I like the idea of using 100% of the animal, putting it back into the soil, recycling the nutrients through and I did a lot of research too, and I started recommending when I got into, I've done research on so many organic products, and I haven't found any red flags around slaughterhouse products other than the fact that we're confining animals, and that's upsetting to me.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would say the way we treat animals is humane or it's a great industry. But I think the reality of it's not going anywhere. And the highest use case for these waste products is really something to consider from a sustainability perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely. And to your point, I really like that. The vast majority of what that animal consumes is going to go out in its manure. It's not going to necessarily bioaccumulate in its bones. So, yeah.
yeah. And if you say, okay, well, I don't want to use bone meal, I'm going to use karanja meal or neem cake because it's more eco-friendly. Think about the fact that it's being shipped all the way across the ocean with all those fossil fuels to get to us, and that we actually had Suzanne was telling me about a facility in Oregon that failed for traditional chemistry, a pesticide that's no longer used in the United States, hasn't been since the 70s.
Right.
But they
But in
got hit
India
for
or
it.
whatever. Totally.
That neem tree had been sprayed. So there's no perfect amendment is what we come back to here. So yes, you should always like, this is a great question, Smiley. Like it's something you should absolutely be thinking about. But like at the end of the day, you have to make a decision as to what makes the most sense from a sustainability perspective for you. And I just learned from Suzanne earlier this week that there's microplastics in cardboard, or not microplastic, PFAS, those forever chemicals. And they're finding them showing up in soils now, specifically from cardboard mulching.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I mean, that's freaky and sad because PFAS is like, that is everywhere. That's prolific. It's in my Gore-Tex rain jacket. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's why it works. That's why it keeps me dry. And so that means it's all over my house. But I've always struggled with cardboard because I look at cardboard, it's covered in tape. And even if you take the tape off, it's like, man, that's just like, there's a lot in that. But again, if you, I try not to overthink it because otherwise, it's a bad mental place for me to be.
Yeah. All right. Let's end on a positive. I thought this was a great question, and I have an answer, and I'm so curious to hear yours though. What's the biggest limiting factor in living soil that you see most often? I'm going to narrow it down to two things. I've been thinking about it because I knew what question I was going to ask. Do you want me to go first while you?
Yeah, because I'm still thinking. Yeah.
Okay. So the first one I would say is watering. People just not properly watering for their media. And that means keeping it, the way I like to start, keeping it evenly moist so that we're getting as much nutrient cycling, keeping the biology happy to cycle nutrients for the plant. Where I see problems is with people over or under watering quite a bit with living soils. Even if that soil is very fertile or well balanced, if the soil is drying out a lot or it's overly wet, you're going to have an unhappy plant with root hair death, and it's going to cause problems. So that's by far number one. Number two would be imbalanced online recipes where people are putting in too much of a nutrient. It's really hard as a grower to take that mentality of less is more, because you want your plant to grow as fast as possible. So you want to put as much stuff in there as you can, and you want to hit it with all these different enzyme products and teas and everything, thinking that you're helping the plant. And I find that the biggest limiting factor is sometimes that works, but when it doesn't and you've used 30 different things, it's really hard to figure out and work backwards to figure out what was actually a limiting factor and what might have been over applied level of toxicity and what might be lacking or missing or out of balance. So those would be my two.
So I think the one that comes to mind for me is, it used to be, I feel like, 10 years ago, it was like you grow in these big pots. And then in the last 10 years, I've seen oftentimes the pot size shrinking. And so the biggest limiting factor that I see, this is mostly in new grows, beginner growers, or just not beginner growers, but just new operations that are limited on canopy size. They're trying to maximize their plant count in a small space. And so sometimes I see people trying to grow in living soil in these really small pots. And Tad, I think years ago, you did a great job promoting beds. I think beds are totally the way to go. But I guess my point is a lot of people still use very small pots. And I saw the trend go from 30 to 20 to 15 to 7. And so the limiting factor to me is not feeding enough when your soil volume is really small. So like you got to match the soil volume to the length of growing, to the amount of supplemental nutrition you're putting into living soil. So in beds, much more forgiving, large soil volume, much more forgiving. But so many times I, make recommendations on the soil, and then someone shoots me a picture of a deficiency, and I say, what have you fed? They've barely fed anything, and they're in like week 8 of flower, and they're in these tiny little pots. I know that's a little bit of an extreme example. Most of you are probably thinking I would never do that, but I think just mismatching feeding and soil volume is a big limitation. If I were to get technical with it, and I'm not going to explain this one, but it's possible that the limiting factor is also often oxygen, which is kind of the inverse of water, but oxygen can be very limiting.
Do you mean with gas exchange in the soil itself through watering?
Yeah.
Which gets back to our dissolved water oxygen levels.
So like, I think that in a living soil, there's often nothing you can do about this. We already have well aerated soils. We have enough aggregate, et cetera, but oxygen in the root zone, it goes back to where we started this conversation. That is a big limitation across all of agriculture in terms of plant health and growth. The functions of roots.
I will say I've had growers that fight me on container size. They're like, I don't have the space to do it. I can't fit a bed, or I can't do a larger container. But then they try it, and literally all of these deficiencies that they were chasing just go away.
Exactly. It's like that, or you have to you have to move your thinking from, I'm going to create this perfect living soil, to I'm going to be a master of feeding, which is fine. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but you got to get really good at feeding. Like, you got to be on it. You got to create the right feed solutions and test them and optimize them and really make sure that you're nailing it. It's kind of like, I don't want to say organic hydro, but you got to be a little bit more on that side of the spectrum where you're really nailing and which I think is a cool way to grow too. I mean, everyone's got their own style of cultivation, but that's where you want to be thinking, because 7 gallons of soil is going to change so fast that really what you're feeding is a function of, the nutrition of the plant is a function of what you're putting in at that point, and not what the base soil mix was.
I mean, at that point, I feel like you might as well run bottled nutrients. But yeah, I get what you're saying.
I would say you can always customize a feeding plan using the same sort of like non-branded, but sort of, I should say non-bottled nutrient lines. Like, I think it's kind of cool to be able to create your own custom formulations using individual nutrient ingredients. Essentially, you're using bottled nutrients, but you have the independence. You're doing so without subscribing to someone else's, expensive product. So I think there's value in just being your own self-sufficient formulator, and not buying bottled nutrients. I just can't say I would ever recommend doing that. I think that skill set is interesting and kind of an interesting way to grow.
Yeah. And I did post a link here, and unfortunately when I posted it, because I'm hosting it, it sends it like it's coming from you and me. These comments are all from me, just so folks know, in the comment section here. But this was a study that Ben Higgins did at Gold Leaf Gardens, comparing plants grown in 30-gallon pots versus a 4x4 bed with about a half-yard soil. So essentially, long story short, the plants grown communally outperformed the ones grown in 30-gallon pots, even though per plant, that 30-gallon pot had more soil, that plant in there had more soil, it yielded lower. And I think that has to do more with root space and maybe some plant-to-plant interactions that we're still learning about. But the fact that root space was not a limiting factor, because the roots could reach out wherever they wanted into that bed, is what I would attribute it to. But
Also,
Yeah,
less water fluctuation, which I think is super important when it comes to if you think about the total time. So even if the nutrition in one soil is the same in a pot versus a bed, the amount of time those nutrients are available in a 24-hour period or in a 1 week period is a function of how moist the soil is through that. So if the soil is consistently moist, the nutrients are always available. As soon as it dries out, the nutrition could be the same between the pot and the bed, but the nutrients aren't available. So I just think the beds also just maintain more consistent moisture throughout the entire profile, which just makes a massive difference in terms of the plant's ability to uptake them.
I totally agree. Well, thanks for your time today. I think next week I've been thinking of topics here while we were chatting, and I think a fun one would be sort of like your go-to pantry products. Like as a grower,
love that. Yeah.
What tools, amendments, what things should everyone have in their garden pantry?
I love that because I've obsessed about this, and I do have favorites.
Yeah.
And I don't talk about them a lot because, well, that's not true. I talk about them occasionally, but I would love to share what I like to do. And I sort of lightly recommend things to people, but I have my personal favorites that are both rooted in sort of science and experience, but also just rooted in my intuition, sort of just things I've seen do well and things that I like because I connect to them. What we were talking about earlier, sometimes I have a connection with a product because I know what the source of it is versus like I've never seen a karanja or a neem tree, like I've never seen a neem tree. So it's not in my local, so I can't connect to that product as much. So that's literally might be the reason I've never used neem seed oils. That's like, I don't have a connection to the source. So I think that's a cool conversation because I do think everyone should have like a little bit of a connection to the things they're using, or at least a story or an understanding. So I think that's a cool question to ask, Tad, and I'd like to hear, yours too.
Yeah, I look forward to getting into that with you. I'll have to make a little bit more of a concrete list because I'm thinking of everything from tools for measuring, like meters and things like that. I have some here that I can share, and then also like we mentioned, like things like fish hydrolysate and gypsum. And
did you use the word tools? Did I misinterpret that as products?
Well, so some are products, and and to be clear, I do sell some products. Bryant, you sell some products. I want to do this though as agnostically as possible, and share the products. Talk about the ones that I really like. And frankly, not all of them I sell. Like I really love BioWorks. I don't sell any of their products. They just make good products. But so yeah, but we can talk about
tools. Okay. Well, I'll show up and I'll have a couple physical tools as well. We can talk. I've got I won't spill the beans, but I have by far I have my favorite tool. I'll bring it.
Perfect. All right. Yeah. Next Wednesday, 3:00 Pacific. I look forward to seeing you and hopefully the rest of you guys here too.
Yeah, thanks everyone who tuned in. This is a fun conversation.
Yeah. All right.
See ya.